the growth of the platform function has actually grown faster in the last few years than venture capital as a whole industry. How do I raise VC funding? But I actually think that's the wrong question.
Welcome to She Talks Business. In this episode, we have Zara Zaman, head of platforms at Emerge Education. As Europe's most active EdTech investor, Emerge has a portfolio of 70 companies that have collectively raised over $500 million and achieved a combined market cap of over $1 billion.
At Emerge, Zara is curating a strong ecosystem of educators, founders, and industry leaders, championing the next wave of EdTech startups that are set to transform the future of work.
Zara, as head of platforms at Emerge, what do you really do?
Great question. And it might be useful for me to start with a short explanation on Emerge as a fund. Absolutely. And then I can talk about platform. But Emerge is a pre-seed and seed. So for those who are not in the venture capital industry, that's early stage venture capital fund. And we invest in companies in the future of learning, future of workspace. So we look at companies that are fundamentally democratizing access to opportunity, whether it's leveling the playing field for kids or helping people build more fulfilling careers, but anything that really helps people access the knowledge and skills they need at the lowest possible cost to fulfill their potential. And as a team, we're all kids of immigrants, refugees, working class parents. So we've had very first-hand experiences with seeing the generational impact of education, which is why we've dedicated our careers to it. And then to get back to your question on platform, platform is a relatively new function in venture capital. And to put it simply, platform is everything you do for a company that you invest in other than the money. So it's how you support them beyond that. And what I've learned in my 2.5 years in this role is really that platform means many different things in different funds. So it could be helping your companies get the right talent. It could be helping them with go-to-market, with their biz ops. It could be helping them with finding the right advisors. And for us at Emerge, what we do is we focus on community. So we have a venture partner community of 100 of the top people in education, founders, operators, chief learning officers at top corporations who have been there and done it before in this industry and can really support our founders as they build out their companies in the early stages.
Amazing. And so technically what that means is building an ecosystem within the fund that supports your own portfolio companies. Is that right?
Exactly. And actually, the interesting thing about platform is, as I mentioned, it's relatively new, but the growth of the platform function has actually grown faster in the last few years than venture capital as a whole industry. Wow. And the funds that invest in their platform functions actually have outsized returns compared to funds that don't. So to put it again simply, funds that will invest in their platform teams and supporting their portfolio companies and founders actually get better results from those portfolio companies.
Mm-hmm. Right. One of the things that was very interesting about your work was that you've worked across ecosystems. So Europe, Asia, and so on. Are there any, of course, similarities, but also differences? What makes a startup ecosystem better than the other or more robust than the other? What kind of startup ecosystem have you seen produce better results for founders in that ecosystem? What are some insights that you would share?
Sure. I'll preface this by saying that Emerge is a global fund, but we major on Europe. And so most of our portfolio companies are Europe-based. We have some in the US and then some dotted all over Australia, South Africa, Mexico, Canada. But personally, I have been traveling a lot over the last 4.5 years. I've been living out of a suitcase, moving every 6 weeks, which has brought me to Bali. But a lot of that is personal preference rather than looking at companies. That said, I have been super lucky to observe the startup ecosystem in many different countries and regions. And I think there are a few key trends that really make a region stand out and allow startups to flourish. One of them is access to capital. So VC is just one way that you can get money as a founder if you're building something, but it does rely on people being able to take big bets on very innovative ideas early on. So that's one of them. Another one is the talent pipeline. So you want ambitious founders, but those ambitious founders need to be able to hire great talent. Another element is the community. I think having a community of people who understand the sort of startup ecosystem, the investing side of things, people that are excited to work in startups, that's super important. And as a fund at Emerge, we really think community is one of the best things you can provide early stage founders with. So I think those are three really key things. And another thing I'll add as well is actually government policy and regulation. That makes a massive difference and can either contribute to brain drain or really boost the level of startups. If you take the Middle East, for example, we don't have any investments there yet, but I spent 10 years growing up in Dubai, and I am frequently back there to visit my family. And it's a nascent ecosystem in general, the Middle East. But we're seeing now that as particularly the Gulf region tries to diversify from oil, a lot of the governments there are investing heavily in their founders, startups, and also creating a lot of incentives to create companies and invest in them as well.
One of the things that you mentioned, and also it's been my experience running an accelerator, is the quality of the founder, right? And sometimes it's really hard to find the right kind of founders that you want to invest in. So at Emerge, when you're looking for founders to invest in, because my understanding is you're also looking at idea stage where it's all about the founder, right? What are you really looking for? What makes a good founder? What makes a founder investable? Because at that point, I think it is the founder that you're investing in. So you're really looking at the investability of the founder. But what are some of those things that make a founder stand out?
It's a great question, and I think there's a couple of ways to answer this. So firstly, we are very early stage investors. So what we'll look for is a bit different to later stage investors. And part of that is because you have a lot more information, you have their traction, their revenue, etc. When you're investing early stage, sometimes as early as just an idea, a founder comes to us with nothing created yet. They're like, hey, this is what I want to build, and this is why I'm the person to build it. We sometimes invest in companies that early, which means that we don't have that much to go off when we make these decisions. So there are two key factors that we really look at. Other smaller things, but these are the two big ones. One is the founder. That is, I think, the most important thing, or the founding team. Are these people that have the ambition to build $1 billion company in the next 10 years? What have they done in their past that shows that it doesn't really matter what it is, but they're super passionate individuals with great hustle. They know how to work with other people and inspire them. I think leadership is a big part of it. How do you get people to come on that journey? Do they understand the field deeply? And I think the other side is like, have they seen firsthand or experienced the pain point that they're solving for? So it's not necessary that they've experienced it firsthand, but they need to show that they have a very deep understanding of the customer that they're solving a problem for and why they'll pay for it. So I'd say there's a few factors there. And then the other side is the market. So is it a market that we're excited about, that's growing fast, that we see massive potential in? Those are the two factors. The other part of when you ask the question of, what do you look for in VC, I think a lot of people ask us, how do I raise VC funding? But I actually think that's the wrong question, because VC funding isn't for everyone. For 99% of founders, it's not the right route. And that doesn't mean that they're not building successful businesses. It's just that the companies that VCs invest in are very specific. VC relies on the power law that every single company you invest in has the potential to return your fund 50 times over, which means every company you invest in needs to be $1 billion outcome potential. Not every company is like that, and most successful companies are actually not in that category. So it's a very specific type of founder. And if you're not looking at VC money, there's actually a lot of other types of funding, be it grants, be it bootstrapping, be it angel investing, patient capital, that might actually be a better fit. So one key thing is we want a founder to have thought about why they're actually raising VC money. Can they reach those outcomes? And are those outcomes that they actually are looking to reach? I would say having a very clear answer to that question is really important.
Yeah, I think that's something that needs a lot of education and awareness, in terms of we've suddenly seen so much conversation around venture capital that it feels like that's the only way to grow a business or a startup. I was recently having a conversation with somebody who said the same thing. They were like, we're trying to raise capital. Can you connect us to the right VCs, etc.? And I had the same question in terms of, do you think this is the right business for VC? Because I felt like I wasn't sure and I didn't really understand the business model. So I was like, I don't really understand, but I want to know from you. And it suddenly felt like they didn't want to explore any other option. And it feels like it's just become glamorous as well to be, it's sort of become like a metric of success.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. I think the idea of, getting your raise announced in TechCrunch it has become glamorous. It's a bit of a vanity metric. And what people also don't realize sometimes is that if you're the wrong business model for VC and then you do get VC investment, VC money could kill your business if you're not building for that scale. So even in EdTech, for example, let's take boot camps. So I think there were some bootcamp business models that would have actually done really well had they not had the pressure of achieving the outcomes necessary for VC. Because if you're looking at something that needs to scale really, really rapidly, but your business model requires a lot of manual effort on making your student experience amazing, or your business model works best when students have a lot of attention from individual mentors, for example. It may not be the best business model for venture capital, but it might be a fantastic business model in general. So I think that's the other thing that sometimes people overlook.
I think another mistake that we've been seeing within the startup space is we hear a lot of tech, right? We hear EdTech, FinTech, Agri-Tech, but I think what's missing in those startups is the Ed and the Fin and the Agri. A lot of times where there's a lot of fancy tech, but very little understanding of the domain that they're working in. And I think I came across one of your posts as well, which said something like, put the Ed back in EdTech. So I want you to elaborate a little bit more on that.
I love that question. It's a big problem, I'd say, in EdTech, particularly as EdTech has become sexy in the last few years. Post-pandemic, especially with the skyrocketing of AI and implementation into education, we've seen the massive potential in this market. And even Sam Altman, for example, has recognized education as a massive market that can be transformed by AI. We've seen for the first time a lot of people coming into EdTech or education that don't have education backgrounds. They're just attracted by the market potential, which is fine. But I think sometimes it then becomes easy to overlook the fact that if you're in EdTech, you also need to think about what are the learning outcomes, because it's easy to focus on building flashy tech, focused on how many users are downloading your app, but overlook, okay, what are the learning outcomes? What does your actual retention look like beyond the first few months? And I think that's absolutely not easy. One thing that we advise as Emerge is getting input from learning scientists early on, because if you bake that in from day one, you're going to have much better learning outcomes, which in the long term will help you be more competitive than someone who realizes later that they haven't actually thought about that and tries to shoehorn it in. And so part of our venture partner community, we have learning scientists, for example, like the ex-CLO of Busuu, the language learning app. And they really support our companies on this. And the other thing as well is, I think being an EdTech founder is not easy because you're constantly juggling the learning outcomes, but also making your product super engaging, making it sticky. And those things sometimes clash. And particularly with the TikTokification of our education, right? You're trying to get young people to learn, and you're looking at the apps that are popular these days and actually hold young people's attention. And you have this dilemma, right? Because you realize that TikTok's one of the best formats to capture their attention, but also you've got to question how much are they really learning if it's a 10-second clip or less. And, I think it's an open question, but that's one of the dilemmas that founders have to deal with.
And so far in your experience, have you come across things that have worked, right? I think when we talk about EdTech, Duolingo almost always comes up in terms of how amazingly well they've done. But what are some things that have worked in EdTech, particularly, like you said, from a stickiness perspective? And I think retention probably, or completion rates are probably the biggest challenge, I would assume, in EdTech. But correct me if I'm wrong, like what are the biggest challenges? But also, what is working right now in EdTech and what isn't?
You're absolutely right. I think retention is one of the biggest challenges, particularly if you're building a consumer product. And I think the interesting thing about education is you almost have to sell twice, because what's unique about education is in most cases, the person buying your product is not actually your end user. So be that a parent, be that schools, universities, or corporates, your learner is actually divorced from your buyer. There are some cases that may not be true, for example, in the lifelong learning space, but in most cases that is true. And so you have to think about both elements of that. In terms of the end user in like stickiness and retention, I think there's two ways that you can look at it. If a learner is in your product and using it, I think generally the stickiest products fit into two categories. One, it is required, for example, like by their company in order to upskill. And there's a clear reason that they're doing this course, for example. They have a very strong motivation, and maybe that's tied to a promotion or financial outcome, or maybe it's tied to career mobility. But that is a need for them. The other element is this edutainment emerging category. And I think Duolingo falls into that a little bit. I think it's almost sitting in between the two, because if you're looking at learning English as a second language, that's massive in terms of the impact it can have on your career. The other side is Duolingo is really fun to use, and they really pay attention to their users. I think they have one of the best teams on social media. And particularly with TikTok, they're really resonating with Gen Zs. But I think that, it comes down to a bunch of different things. And we're seeing the emergence of the Duolingo style app in many different categories. So one of our investments, for example, is like the Duolingo for relationships. So the idea being that you learn about each other's communication styles, love languages, how to build a better foundation. So you avoid ending up in couples therapy. And a lot of the things that have worked for Duolingo are working for that company as well. We've seen the same thing for companies building apps for religion. I think Hallow is one of the best funded ones. We have one in our company building the Duolingo for Islam, for example. But I think there's a lot of small things, whether it's keeping the community aspect. You have a leadership board, you can add friends, and then you have the streak element. So a lot of those. But I think those are the two things I'd say, either really integrating it into either a learning pathway, can be informal education, so to complete your degree or your school qualification, or in the workforce, or making it really fun. I think the best apps that are not required in those formal settings, they really understand how to delight their user.
When I was thinking about our conversation, I think one of the things, and you also mentioned, right, there's edutainment, there's language learning, there's all these different verticals and categories. And I was thinking when I generally think of EdTech, there's platforms like Udemy and stuff, right, that comes up. And maybe Duolingo comes up because, we talk so much about it and we hear so much about it. But it was an interesting realization for me how there's so many different verticals and business models within EdTech. And so this might be a very, broad question, but I would love to understand the landscape a little bit in terms of what are the different verticals or categories and business models that exist within the EdTech space, and which are the most sort of common ones or the ones that you see most potential in?
Great question, and I can answer this on a broad level and then add some more specifics. I think to understand the education landscape, it's also useful to understand how it's evolved, because you hear a lot about EdTech now, particularly post-COVID, but there was a nascent EdTech scene before that. So you can think of it as three waves. So you have, let's call it the Stone Age of EdTech. Early 2010, there was a lot of excitement and ambition in, bringing tech into education, but there wasn't much money and there wasn't much realism about where the market was actually at that point. Late 2010s, let's call it the classical period. You first saw the real mass digitization of education materials. You saw content, you saw marketplaces, and this did a lot for really democratizing access to education. It made it much more affordable at scale. Now, if you're looking at the last few years with AI, let's call that the Renaissance period. That is really exciting, because what we're seeing for the first time is the ability to see personalized education at scale, because until this point, that was the trade-off. We have known for a long time that the most effective way of teaching someone is actually personalized tutoring, one-on-one tutoring with someone who understands how you learn, they understand what your goals and outcomes are. But previously, one-on-one tutoring has only been affordable to the top, 5% of the world. And now with AI, we actually have the opportunity to put a personalized tutor in every kid's pocket who can actually teach them at their pace, at their level, for their outcomes, and never gets tired or frustrated. If you're a kid that loves baseball, it can explain a maths question in baseball terms to you. And I think that's one of the most beautiful, exciting things about this stage in EdTech. So I'd say, that broadly is the kind of evolution of EdTech to where we are today. And then another way of looking at it is sort of from pre-K to grey. So we think about education, I think largely because everyone has had some sort of interaction with education, usually in the formal way of school, sometimes university, higher education. That's what people think about when they think about EdTech. They think about education as sitting in a classroom in rows facing a whiteboard or blackboard and learning material like that because they have to be there. And one of my favorite quotes is this Mark Twain quote that goes something along the lines of, "I never let my schooling interfere with my education." And I bring that up to preface this idea that education is so much more than what's in those four walls of school or university. So you can think about it as pre-K. There's a lot of great startups working in the early years space, and the impact of what you teach your kid at early years, what they're exposed to, is absolutely massive. Then you have school, you have university, or alternative pathways into employment. So university isn't for everyone. I think we have really pushed this, particularly in today's society, as like the way to get into jobs, when actually we're realizing now that so many kids are getting so far into debt, graduating with a degree, and then struggling to find the employment that they were promised. So I think another exciting area of EdTech is actually alternatives to higher education that allow them to gain the skills and knowledge they need at a much lower price point to access the jobs that they're excited about. And then beyond that, I think there's a whole other category of learning. That's how do you build a fulfilling career? How do you actually understand how to level up, how to move into different industries? Learning should be thought of as a lifelong activity. And I think what's particularly exciting now is we're moving away from learning just being something you do in a classroom to learning as something you do every single day. And particularly with AI, there'll be a lot of that without even realizing it. AI will be integrated into your everyday work, nudging you that, have you thought about this? Or have you tried this? Or the last 3 times you approach something this way, have you thought about this? And I think that's super exciting. The whole future of work, workforce development and learning space as well.
That's amazing. I think you did a great job sort of breaking it down in a way which I mean, it's easier for me to now see how there's so many layers to within the EdTech space, right? It's not, otherwise generally when I think about EdTech, it's a very, like I said, it's Udemy and there's these 1 or 2 categories, but I think that's very exciting. Also exciting because I feel like the kind of careers are no longer linear, right? Like that's the thing, something that a lot of us still struggle with in terms of figuring out what do we want to do next, even at our stage, right? When we've spent so many years in a particular space or in multiple spaces and we're still trying to figure out. But I think there's also that coaching element that AI provides. But do you think there's also some challenges associated with relying on AI for advice?
I think it's a really good question. I think obviously it's easy to think of many benefits that come with AI in terms of having something that's very personalized, non-judgmental, private, ideally. But on the flip side, I think I was having a very interesting conversation with a friend today that I don't think this is necessarily in our lifetime, but over the long, taking a long view, I wonder if there will be some parts of our brains that we just don't use anymore. So for example, if we become very reliant on using ChatGPT, if on average people will become less creative because you're used to getting answers, not just in terms of knowledge retrieval, but also in terms of, oh, how should I approach this? Or this is the situation, what should I do? And I think if we're not careful, that can replace a lot of those thought processes that we have that force us to think creatively. I think the top 1-5% will actually use AI to be even more creative, and it will open up the possibilities. But that is to say, on average, I think there is the possibility that it does make us a little bit more reliant and perhaps less able to critically think or think creatively. And so I that's the other thing when people are designing learning products, particularly with AI, is to really think, how can we avoid that? How can we nudge the learner to not see, let's look at AI tutors, which is one of the biggest categories that has emerged in EdTech. How do we make sure this is not a, hey, here's the answer to your question, but let me teach you actually what is the process. Let me excite you about this topic so you ask me more questions. How do we integrate the Socratic method of teaching rather than just here's your answer?
And particularly there's a lot of money going into EdTech right now. Why do you think right now is AI the reason why? Because you mentioned that had a huge role to play in making EdTech scalable and personalized. Do you think that's the reason why there's so much attention in EdTech, and is that the reason why now is the right time for EdTech? What is so exciting about EdTech right now? And what are some of the trends that you're seeing which make it the right time, or which make it a good time for somebody to start an EdTech startup?
So the interesting thing is actually EdTech funding at the moment is still in decline, because the big hype was around COVID, because suddenly everything was online. You couldn't be in your classical institutions. And all these educational institutions that are incredibly slow moving in general, typically tended to take their time to adopt tech, were forced to bring all their classroom content and lessons online. And they realized it could be done, and this is exciting. And that's when there was a massive hype and a very big bubble around education. Incredibly high valuations for companies, massive rounds. And as we've come out of COVID, that bubble has burst and funding has massively plummeted. That said, the buzz has remained, and there is a lot of excitement. And I think, the category as a whole is an extremely exciting category to be in at this point in time. And I think you've hit the nail on the head that AI has really fundamentally changed things, and particularly for the dichotomy that I've mentioned, that we have never before been able to offer personalized learning at scale, be it for learners in classrooms or for learners who are sitting in an office, or a frontline worker, for example. So categories of learners that have never had products designed for them. If you take frontline workers, traditionally learning in this category has been like, here's a hefty PDF, read it. Super unengaging, super unpersonalized, doesn't actually understand where that individual wants to go with their career. We now have companies building tech-first solutions for that whole category that has been overlooked for decades. And so I think that's super exciting. As at Emerge, we actually released an analysis of all the top AI and tech companies at the moment and the biggest funding rounds, and we identified the 8 exciting opportunities in AI and EdTech at the moment, and we've ranked them so you can access that on our YouTube channel as well. But just to name a few, for example, AI-powered knowledge graphs in workforce settings is massive, because if you think about the way we look for knowledge, let's say in an organization, you look for something and you maybe will look based on a tag, or you'll look, hey, this is the topic, and it will guide you to the page. But ideally, you want to be able to ask a question the same way you ask ChatGPT now or Google previously and get an answer straight away, rather than it saying, hey, are you looking for this page? And so being able to really make the most and optimize the knowledge that sits in an organization is massive. Another area, and I touched on this, is the AI tutor. That's big, because you have this teacher that can sit with you, explain whatever topic you want, never gets bored, endlessly patient as well. I think there's a lot of exciting things happening in making democratizing authorship of learning materials, so making it easier to create content. Again, not necessarily just learning materials for formal environments, but also create personalized content. So we have a company called Algor, where you put in your learning content and it reformats it into mind maps concept maps and different types of presenting that knowledge that are much more interactive. And that has been massive for students because you give a student a PDF and, not super engaging. You turn that same PDF into interactive mind maps or flashcards or a podcast, or let's say it's even a online game show with that same content, and suddenly it becomes way more engaging. So I think that's a really big category as well. But we have a full long list of them detailing why it's super exciting to see AI completely transform education.
One question that's coming to mind is, I think, like you said, personalization at scale could be one objective or one problem that EdTech solves. But what are some other problems that EdTech is really trying to solve for?
I think there's a few different things. So there's, one, reaching populations that have never really had access before. So I think that's part of it, and the personalization at scale is overlaps with that as well. Part of it as well is actually just making learning more fun, because again, we think about learning broadly about as these places that you go to learn, you regurgitate that content again for an exam and you never use it again. Making learning on the go when you need it, for example. So let's say in a work setting, instead of front loading all your content and you don't remember it by the time you actually use it again, making that integrated into your workflow, that so once you come across a certain project or task type, then you actually have the learning content delivered to you just in time when you need it. That's really big. I think, another part, going back to the making learning fun, things like Duolingo. I mean, if you look at Masterclass, has been very successful, and that's learning outside of an institution and not tied to making a promotion, for example, in the workplace. That's simply sitting at home instead of Netflix, for example. But you're actually learning, for example, from Gordon Ramsay, how to cook pasta from scratch, which I think is really cool. And so we have a company called Prentice that is doing masterclass style episodes that show you behind the scenes of the kind of professionals that you're interested in. So if you're interested in breaking into venture capital, you can watch an episode of behind the scenes of what it means to be a venture capitalist, which I think is super exciting. And that's making learning fun. And so I think that's another really big category where it's really exciting to see the development of EdTech really broadening beyond just, here's your content, but we've digitized it.
I mean, one of the reasons I asked that question was because if one of the objectives of EdTech, or a lot of the EdTech startups, is to replace the traditional way that we've been learning, which is your schools and your universities and so on and so forth, then there's also, do you think there's going to be a compromise on the social aspect of going to a school or an institution and learning there? Because there's more than learning a subject or about a particular thing. Or do you think, how do you deal with that?
A lot of people have this idea that AI will replace teachers, for example, or what's the point of going to school if you can learn everything online? And it's a great point that actually the whole socialization aspect is a key part of that learning experience that happens beyond your curriculum. So I think most EdTech investors or EdTech founders generally will agree that the idea of introducing AI into education is not to replace schools and teachers, and certainly not that we all learn separately, individually at home. But rather, if you take a teacher, they are massively overworked, massively underpaid, experiencing burnout at record levels. A third of their time is spent preparing learning materials, marking, creating content, and that's the part that can be automated really easily. Super quickly, you can have high quality learning materials. You can get very fair and rigorous marking of your students' work. And what that enables is you to have more time as a teacher doing the things that you came into teaching to do, spending time with your students, understanding your students, doing things, building relationships, and doing the things that fundamentally humans are great at. And so the whole socialization aspect is super important. And I think we can think of AI as a tool that we can use to allow us to index higher on those things rather than completely cut them out of the loop.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think also another thing that came to mind when you were talking about making learning fun, and then also you mentioned how you could be learning rather than watching Netflix. And the question that came to mind for me was, so you're technically, one, you're competing with Netflix. So one, how do you solve for that problem? How do you compete with Netflix? And two, the entire, like you said, TikTok talkification of content and trying to make it like bite sized and easy to consume and so on and so forth. I I see something wrong with that, where we're saying we want to replace one addiction with another. Like we want people to be hooked to another app instead of this other app, right? Do you think there's a way to solve that problem, or am I missing something, or is that an actual problem at all?
I think it definitely is a problem, and let's go to your TikTokification point. It's definitely a dilemma, and I think you have so many students spending hours and hours each day on TikTok consuming content, which is a massive problem. And there's one school of thought that's like, hey, it's a much bigger problem to break that addiction. In the meantime, at least there's some benefit in switching from spending those hours on TikTok to spending those hours on a version of TikTok where you're actually learning content, let's say for your GCSEs, and it's created by your peers specifically for you. Now, I think the key thing, going back to what I said about the learning science, is that you can back it up with outcomes. And I would be surprised if the exact format of TikTok is amazing for learning outcomes. However, I think we always need to evolve how we're teaching, and the best companies will be the ones that are really listening closely to their users and what they need. And so part of that is, hey, yes, I know that Gen Zs find this format most interesting and most exciting, but also why are they learning things? Part of it is learning on topics they're interested in, but let's say the formal learning for school, for university, etc., it's because they want to pass exams. And so part of that understanding the customer is also understanding that, yeah, they like TikTok, but they also need to pass their exams, degrees, etc. And so that learning outcomes piece plays a big part there. And if you're looking at students as well, at the end of the day, parents are the ones paying for that.
Yeah.
And so you need to convince parents that your app is actually good enough to deliver on those learning outcomes. But I think, it doesn't necessarily have to be, here's your TikTok feed to learn. There's one model that's really exciting that Physics Wallah has followed in India, but we have a company doing something similar in Europe called My EdSpace, and we think of it as the Twitch for education. So you have basically these celebrity teachers who are phenomenal at teaching a group online, because I think that's a very different skill to teaching a group in a classroom. And they get the kids really excited. They're influencer teachers who are brilliant experts at their subjects. And so all these students will come to this, essentially a webinar with their celebrity teacher who teaches them a core part of their curriculum. And these kids are excited to be there. And to get kids in that age group, school-going age, excited to be in a class about GCSE maths is an incredibly impressive feat. But then you have that, and then every kid is supported by a mentor in a one-to-one capacity or in a much smaller group capacity where they can work through homework problems. So it's massively scalable. But to get that scale and that excitement about the learning is really interesting. And that's just one example of a model that is working really well, and parents are paying for it. They're seeing the outcomes. It's been transformational because the price point of that is allowing kids whose parents could never have afforded tutoring for them before to access tutoring that's actually engaging. And there's the whole social aspect. So that's just one example that works really well and doesn't necessarily follow this idea of you need to create a very addicting app in the same way that TikTok or Instagram is.
Yeah. You mentioned understanding the user, listening to the user. I think one of the things that we're seeing very frequently in startups is, or one of the mistakes that a lot of times startups make generally, and I want to know more specifically from an EdTech perspective, is what are the metrics that they're following and what are they measuring in terms of success? And maybe part of it comes from being a VC-funded startup in terms of they're very different metrics that you are looking at when you're a VC-funded startup, the pressure to grow and so on and so forth. But in the EdTech space, what are some important metrics of success that startups should be looking at? And I'm sure it would vary across the kind of startup that you're, or the kind of space that EdTech operates in. But what are those metrics? How do you figure out if you're on the right track in terms of not just growing in numbers, but also in terms of the value that you're delivering?
It's a great question. And I would say that the metrics themselves that you're measuring are not that different to a product outside of EdTech. You're looking at the same kind of metrics, be it retention, churn, engage, etc. But what is different is maybe the metrics themselves, because one thing, for example, that's specific about EdTech is if you're building for school age or university age, you would expect drop off over summer. If you're building a social media network and your retention or your usage stats drop and plummet over July, August, you would be really, really panicking. Yeah. But if you're in education, it's normal, and you would expect that to come back up in September. So the exact metrics and, for example, the time periods might be different, but the key things are pretty much the same. So if you look at, I think biggest one is retention, and you can think of retention as revenue retention or engagement. So how many times, there's different ways to measure engagement as well. How many times a week or a month are your users coming back and using your product? One of the biggest problems that we see in startups, and again, not specific to EdTech, is a very loose definition of what retention is. So you can think of retention, part of it is you're tracking a user getting to an activation point, or doing an activity, let's say logging into an app and completing one lesson as an example. But some people will monitor retention as, oh, they've just opened the app. But if they're not doing anything, that's not really classed as a retained user. So that's, one example. You want to look at the flip side of that as well, your churn. So how many people are leaving? Why are they leaving? Are they going to a competitor? Definitely other metrics that you need to take into consideration. Later, you want to look at growth. So how satisfied are your customers? Doing an NPS score or the superhuman PMF score is another really good one. You want to look at the viral coefficient. How well are your referrals working? And then sort of as you grow, you really want to be paying close attention to your CAC, and especially CAC to LTV. Mm. So how much is your cost of acquisition of a customer, and what is that against the lifetime value of that customer? Mm. And so those are things that really in any industry you need to be paying close attention to. Mm.
Cool. Another thing that's coming to mind is particularly I think we're going on a tangent, but away from the conversation that we're currently having. But when a founder comes to you for funding, is there enough data available for them to be able to understand the market? What are those data points for somebody to know if there's a market for, because that you mentioned that was one of the important things when you look at, right? One is founders, and then obviously the size of the market and the growth potential. How do they measure that? What are the data points or metrics there before one even starts? And even in terms of, okay, maybe I can do some user research, but what are those benchmarks that'll tell me there's a growth potential?
It really depends what type of market within, let's say, education you're looking at. But the key thing really is you're seeing budget holders. So be that in the corporate world, or you're looking at parents who are willing to actually spend on your product. Because a lot of the time we see founders who come up with this great product and it's super exciting, but at the end of the day, they've designed it for employees, and actually companies don't have the budget for it right now. So you look at DEI budgets, for example, unfortunately have gone down in recent years after they had spiked. And so that's one key thing, that you're actually tapping into a budget that is increasing, and it has to be tied to a need. So for example, if you're looking in the hiring space, retention is a massive problem of your employees. And so if you can show that actually your product is retaining employees, that's a massive ROI for a company. So I think the big thing is you obviously have the market more broadly, you have the spend and the budgets. And then I think just the key thing that people and founders can do very early stage is speak to your customer. And you need to speak to both the end user and also the paying customer. And first stage problem is we don't have enough customer interviews or customer data. Second stage problem is, okay, we have some customer data and interviews, but I've actually only spoken to the end user. I've actually never spoken to the person who's going to be paying for this product. So whenever I speak to a founder, almost always I'm like, how many customer interviews have you done? And almost always they can add another 0 to that. If, that would be fantastic to get that data when you can. It is obviously more difficult if you don't have funding, but if you can get pilot customers, fantastic. And you get that feedback and to show you're iterating very quickly. I think the best founders show immense hustle. So before they've got funding, they've been able to put some sort of MVP out there and get feedback from their target customer and show that, hey, we're solving a real pain point here. They're paying for it. And this is how we can increase that and scale that over time.
And what is the biggest support that, in your opinion, because particularly because you also are working on the platform, what is the biggest need for entrepreneurs at a stage when, very early stage, right? When they're at idea stage or whatever. What do you think they need the most support in? Is it understanding the market? Is it finding their first few customers? Is it figuring out how to build a product? What is it?
I think the first thing founders will say is capital. That's a big one. And then the second thing, and then particularly at early stage, is getting access to people who've been there and done it before and understand your market. So at Emerge, I mentioned earlier our venture partner community, and this has been one of the biggest supports to our founders. And this is, one-off chats on supporting, hey, I'm speaking to this customer. What are things I should maybe think about in my pitch? But they're also more long-term things. So for example, one of our venture partners became the chairman of one of our companies. Many of them are advisors to our companies. Many of them are angel investors. A lot of them are informal mentors. But having someone who understands the particularities of your market, and we've touched on a few of them in education, is super important, because someone can say, hey, I've been in that exact same problem, or ideally, I can help you avoid that problem because I've been there, done that. That's massive. I think customer intro is also super valuable. Being connected with people who can connect you with the decision makers at your target companies is super helpful. But in general, I think one of the biggest things beyond the capital is having the community of people that are highly relevant and really excited to help you. They're excited about what you're building. I think the great thing about education is it's very mission driven. And so people are usually in education because they're really excited about it. They're passionate about it. And so having people that really want you to succeed and buy into the mission that you're building is fundamental.
I think I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the role of an investor in the growth or success of a startup. Is it right for an entrepreneur or a founder to come in with the expectation that, what we call smart capital, which is not just money, but there's other things coming with it. There's expertise, there's connections, so on and so forth. Is that the right expectation? One, and then I also want to hear from the VC side of things. Should somebody be becoming a VC or setting up a fund if they don't have what it takes to help a founder succeed?
Great question. I think as a founder, if you're building an amazing company and you're in the position where you actually have the option to choose where your capital comes from, I think it's a big mistake not to take smart capital that can open doors for you. You can choose whether or not you take them up on it, and you can choose at what stage you take them up on it, but that it can really make or break your startup having an investor that just provides capital, or an investor that provides capital and then when it's right for you can actually advise you on your go-to-market. They can help you avoid different mistakes. They can bring you an advisor who brings immense value to your company. They can bring you angel investors. They can amplify your reach when you're hiring, for example. There's just so many additional things that can come with that. I think a key consideration also is, when you're looking at an investor, is this someone that I actually want to sit alongside with? If you're looking at a board table, are these investors going to sit opposite me grilling me and interviewing me and making my life difficult, or are they sitting on the same side, working towards the same goal together? And personal fit is one of the biggest reasons that founders choose investors, and rightly so. So I think that's really massive. And I would advise founders that if you're building a really good company, you should have multiple offers of investment, and really think very carefully about who you want on your cap table, because that's a long-term relationship. So think about it like a marriage. don't jump into it. And yeah, I would say that the smart capital is super important. And then what was the question on the investor side?
Should an investor or somebody think of becoming a VC or set up a fund if they don't have the capacity to support an entrepreneur beyond capital?
I don't think I'm in the position to say whether or not someone should start a fund or become an investor. What I will say is it will be very difficult for you to invest in the top founders. If you're looking to maximize your returns and invest in the best companies, if you can't support founders, it's going to be really hard, because the best founders that I speak to ask me, what do you do to support your founders? Can I actually speak to one of your founders and do a reference check? Can you give me an example of, 3 people that you would connect me to? And we have this venture partner community, which is one of the biggest reasons that we win competitive deals. So all I'll say to that is it's going to be way, way more difficult if you can't support founders.
As a VC, what is a competitive deal?
A competitive deal, can you be a bit more specific about the question, actually?
So, as a VC, how do you know that a deal is really good, where you actually want to compete for it?
Okay. So sometimes you have founders that are building something super exciting, and they, have set a timeline for their fundraise. So there's already a deadline and there's time pressure. And generally, these deals will have multiple investors coming in and looking at it. And I think generally the deal is super competitive when the founder, one, they'll tell you often that, hey, I'm speaking to other investors, sometimes tell you who they're speaking to. But 2, the time which you have to make that decision suddenly becomes shorter and shorter and shorter.
Yeah.
And you need to reach your decision point much more quickly. That said, it doesn't mean that if a company doesn't have multiple offers of investment and they're not creating a super competitive deal, that they're not a good company. It just, there are many factors why that could be different. But particularly with experienced founders, I think they know how to play the VC game, they know how to fundraise, and they can create a lot of that FOMO in the deal. So that's kind of the dynamics there.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Zara. I had a great time. I wish I could have asked all the other questions that we still have left, but either we'll need another episode or maybe we'll send those questions to you because I'm curious. I hope you had a good time, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
If you found this episode interesting, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.